Imagine a time when Europe was not a collection of clearly defined nations, but a chaotic quilt of competing loyalties, ancient traditions, and explosive new ideas. This wasn't too long ago, historically speaking. We're talking about the early 17th century, a period often overshadowed by grander narratives, but one that fundamentally reshaped the continent. This was the era of the 30 Years' War, a conflict so brutal, so widespread, that it truly felt like Europe was tearing itself apart. To understand how such a catastrophe could unfold, we need to go back a little further, to the aftermath of a seismic event that had already cracked the foundations of the old order, the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation, kicked off by Martin Luther less than a century before our story begins, had shattered the religious unity of Western Europe. Before Luther, everyone, from kings to peasants, generally followed the Pope and the Catholic Church. Afterward, huge swathes of Europe, especially in the north, embraced new forms of Christianity like Lutheranism. This wasn't just about theology, it was about power, loyalty, and money. When princes converted, they often seized church lands and assets, shifting immense wealth and influence. This created deep divisions and mistrust, with Catholics and Protestants viewing each other not just as misguided, but as existential threats. For a while, there was an attempt to manage this religious powder keg with something called the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. This agreement tried to bring some order to the Holy Roman Empire, which was the central stage for much of this drama. The core idea was simple: cuius regio, ius religio, which translates to whose realm, his religion. Basically, the ruler of a territory got to decide if that territory would be Catholic or Lutheran. If you didn't like it, you could move. On paper, it sounded like a solution. In practice, it was a shaky truce. It totally ignored one crucial and rapidly growing religious group, the Calvinists. Calvinism, with its strict doctrines and often revolutionary political leanings, was spreading fast, particularly in places like Bohemia and the Palatinate. Its exclusion from the Peace of Augsburg meant that a huge new source of tension was left to fester, like a wound that wouldn't close. The Holy Roman Empire itself was less an empire and more a sprawling, messy collection of hundreds of independent states. Think of it as a patchwork quilt stitched together from duchies, electorates, bishoprics, free cities, and knightly estates, all with their own laws, armies, and interests. The emperor, who was always a Habsburg, was supposed to be the head of this vast entity, but his actual power was limited. He was more of a figurehead, relying on persuasion and alliances, particularly with other Catholic princes, to get anything done. The Habsburgs, a powerful dynasty with roots in Austria, were staunch Catholics. They dreamed of a unified Catholic empire, a vision that clashed violently with the aspirations of the Protestant princes who valued their independence and their new faith. This constant tug-of-war between imperial centralization and princely autonomy, layered with intense religious animosity, made the empire a tinderbox. As the early 17th century dawned, the air grew thick with growing religious and political tensions. It wasn't just about who went to which church anymore. It was about land, about who controlled the votes for the next emperor, about ancient rites and new interpretations. Catholic princes wanted to reclaim church lands that had been seized by Protestants after the Reformation. Protestant princes worried about Habsburg attempts to roll back their religious freedoms and centralize power. These fears weren't imagined. They led to the formation of two massive rival alliances, the Protestant Union in 1608, primarily led by Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, and the Catholic League in 1609, spearheaded by Maximilian I of Bavaria. These weren't just discussion clubs, they were military pacts, ready to mobilize troops at a moment's notice. Localized conflicts began to bubble up everywhere, like small fires before a massive blaze. There were disputes over who controlled certain bishoprics, arguments over the rights of Protestants in Catholic areas, and vice versa. Religious intolerance was on the rise. Catholic priests were sometimes expelled from Protestant territories, and Protestant services were banned in Catholic ones. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper sickness, a growing polarization that made compromise seem impossible. Everyone knew a major confrontation was coming. The only question was where and when the first spark would ignite the whole continent. The stage was set for an unimaginable conflict where faith, power, and survival would intertwine in a deadly dance across the heart of Europe. The fragile peace that had held for decades was about to shatter, plunging millions into a nightmare. The spark that ignited this tinderbox would come from Bohemia, a kingdom with a unique history and a special place within the Habsburg domains. Bohemia wasn't just another territory, it was an elective monarchy, meaning its king was chosen by its nobles, not simply inherited. This gave Bohemian nobles, particularly the powerful Protestant ones, a degree of leverage that nobles in other Habsburg lands didn't have. In 1609, Emperor Rudolf II, a Habsburg, had granted the Bohemian Protestants a document called the Letter of Majesty. This letter was a big deal. It guaranteed them religious freedom, allowing them to build churches and practice their faith without fear of persecution. It was a fragile but vital peace, a promise from the Catholic emperor to his Protestant subjects. However, things changed dramatically with the ascension of Ferdinand II. He was a staunch, uncompromising Catholic, educated by Jesuits, and deeply committed to rolling back the Reformation wherever he could. For Ferdinand, the Letter of Majesty was an affront, a concession he felt was forced upon his predecessor. When he became King of Bohemia, even before becoming emperor, his intentions were clear. He started appointing Catholic officials to key positions and began to restrict Protestant activities, subtly at first, then more overtly. This was a direct challenge to the religious freedoms promised by the Letter of Majesty and a clear sign that Ferdinand intended to centralize power and re-Catholicize Bohemia. The boiling point was reached in 1618. Protestant nobles in Prague were outraged by the closing of some Protestant churches and what they saw as clear violations of the Letter of Majesty. They decided to confront the emperor's representatives directly. On May 23, 1618, a group of angry Protestant noblemen stormed Prague Castle. They found two imperial governors, Willem Slavata of Chlum and Jaroslav Borzita of Martinice, along with their secretary, Philip Fabricius. After a heated argument, the nobles decided on a rather dramatic and symbolic act of protest. They grabbed the three men and, without much ceremony, threw them out of a high window of Prague Castle. This event, known as the Defenestration of Prague, was more than just a bizarre incident. It was a deliberate, audacious challenge to Habsburg authority, a clear declaration that the Bohemian Protestants would not tolerate Ferdinand's policies. Miraculously, the three imperial officials survived the fall, landing in a pile of manure, which Catholics later claimed was proof of divine intervention. Protestants, of course, just said they landed in a soft pile of dung. Regardless of the landing, the message was unmistakable. The Bohemian revolt had begun. The Protestant nobles quickly formed a provisional government, deposed Ferdinand II as their king, and began looking for a new monarch who would truly uphold their religious and political rights. Their choice fell upon Frederick V, the Elector Palatine. Frederick was a prominent Calvinist prince, the head of the Protestant Union, and son-in-law to James I of England. For the Bohemian rebels, electing Frederick seemed like a brilliant move. It would bring a powerful Protestant ally into their corner and signal their defiance to the Habsburgs. Frederick, perhaps too eager for a crown and underestimating the true strength of the emperor, accepted the offer, becoming the new king of Bohemia. This decision was a monumental gamble. With Frederick now on the Bohemian throne, the situation escalated rapidly. Both sides began to mobilize. The Bohemian Provisional Government raised an army, preparing to defend their newfound independence. Ferdinand II, now furious and determined to crush the rebellion, began to gather his own forces, relying on his loyal Catholic allies and the might of the Habsburg Empire. The first clashes of what would become a devastating war began almost immediately. Skirmishes broke out, castles were besieged, and the peaceful fields of Bohemia started to feel the rumble of marching armies. The defenestration of Prague had not just been a symbolic act, it was the trigger that set off a chain reaction, pulling in not just Bohemia and the Habsburgs, but soon all the major powers of Europe into a conflict that would rage for 3 long decades. The initial phase of the war, centered around Bohemia, had begun, and the stakes could not have been higher for the future of the Holy Roman Empire, and indeed for Europe itself. The stage was set for the first major battles, and the world held its breath, unaware of the scale of destruction that was about to unfold. Frederick V, the newly crowned Winter King of Bohemia, quickly learned that a crown did not automatically come with an army strong enough to defend it. His decision to accept the Bohemian throne was a massive miscalculation. He had hoped for strong support from the Protestant Union, an alliance of Protestant states in the Holy Roman Empire that he himself led. However, the Union's backing was hesitant and ultimately insufficient. Many of its members were wary of challenging the powerful Habsburg Emperor directly, fearing the consequences for their own territories. They offered some troops and financial aid, but it was far from the decisive military intervention Frederick desperately needed. The Protestant Union's primary goal was to protect its own members, not necessarily to wage an offensive war in Bohemia. This left Frederick vulnerable, with a largely inexperienced Bohemian army facing the full wrath of the emperor. Ferdinand II, on the other hand, wasted no time. He gathered his forces, bolstered by the eager support of the Catholic League, a military alliance of Catholic states within the empire. The Catholic League was led by Maximilian I of Bavaria, a staunch Catholic and a shrewd military strategist. Maximilian appointed Johann Tserclaes, Count of Tilly, an experienced and ruthless commander, to lead the League's army. Tilly was a veteran soldier, known for his iron discipline and tactical prowess. The combined Imperial and Catholic League forces, well-trained and well-equipped, marched towards Bohemia with a clear objective: crush the rebellion and restore Ferdinand's authority. The decisive confrontation came swiftly on November 8, 1620, just outside Prague. This was the Battle of White Mountain. The Imperial and Catholic League armies, numbering around 27 Hussaren men, faced a slightly smaller Bohemian force, estimated at about 21 Hussaren. However, the Bohemian army was a mix of inexperienced recruits and mercenaries, many of whom were poorly paid and lacked morale. Tilly, with his Bavarian and Imperial troops, exploited the weaknesses in the Bohemian lines. The battle itself was surprisingly short, lasting only about 2 hours. Tilly's forces launched a coordinated attack, breaking through the Bohemian defenses with relative ease. The Bohemian cavalry, disorganized and outnumbered, quickly routed. The infantry, left exposed, soon followed. The imperial victory was overwhelming. The Bohemian army was completely shattered, suffering heavy casualties and widespread desertions. Frederick V, who had been waiting in Prague, fled the city in a panic, earning him the mocking nickname the Winter King, because his reign lasted barely a winter. His dream of a Protestant Bohemia was over. The Battle of White Mountain marked the swift collapse of the Bohemian revolt and a major triumph for Ferdinand II and the Catholic cause. It was a clear sign that the Habsburgs were not to be trifled with. The aftermath of White Mountain was brutal. Ferdinand II, now firmly back in control of Bohemia, exacted a terrible retribution. He saw the rebellion not just as a political challenge, but as a religious heresy. Protestant leaders who had supported Frederick V were arrested, tried for treason, and publicly executed in Prague's Old Town Square. Their heads were displayed on spikes as a grim warning. The lands of these nobles, and indeed the lands of many other Protestant landowners, were confiscated. These vast estates were then redistributed to loyal Catholic nobles, many of whom were foreign mercenaries who had served the emperor. This massive transfer of wealth and power fundamentally changed the social and economic landscape of Bohemia. Even more significant was the forced re-Catholicization of Bohemia. Protestantism, which had flourished there for decades, was systematically suppressed. Protestant churches were closed, and Protestant clergy were expelled. People were given a stark choice: convert to Catholicism or face exile. Thousands of Bohemian Protestants, unwilling to abandon their faith, were forced to leave their homes and seek refuge in other Protestant lands, particularly in Saxony and Brandenburg. This massive exodus further depopulated and impoverished Bohemia, leaving deep scars that would last for centuries. In addition to the repression in Bohemia, Ferdinand II also moved to solidify his power within the Holy Roman Empire. He stripped Frederick V of his electoral title, a highly prestigious position that gave him a vote in electing the emperor. This title, along with the Upper Palatinate region, was transferred to Maximilian I of Bavaria, the leader of the Catholic League. This shift in the electoral college significantly strengthened the Catholic influence within the empire, giving the Habsburgs and their allies a more secure majority. It was a reward for Maximilian's loyalty and a punishment for Frederick's audacity. However, the war was far from over. Frederick V, though defeated in Bohemia, still held his ancestral lands in the Palatinate, a region strategically located along the Rhine River. Ferdinand II and the Catholic League were not content to let him retain this territory, especially after he had challenged the emperor's authority so directly. The imperial armies, now flushed with victory, pushed into the Palatinate. This marked the end of the initial Bohemian phase of the war and the beginning of a new, expanded conflict, often referred to as the Palatinate phase. The fighting spread beyond Bohemia's borders, drawing in more German states and ensuring that the 30 Years' War would not be a localized rebellion, but a wider, more devastating struggle that would engulf much of Central Europe. The Winter King had lost his crown, but his actions had lit a fire that would rage across the continent for decades to come, leaving a trail of destruction and death. The stage was now set for the next chapter of this brutal conflict. The conflict's expansion into the Palatinate drew the attention of other European powers, particularly those with a vested interest in maintaining a balance of power against the rising might of the Habsburgs. Among these, King Christian IV of Denmark emerged as a pivotal figure, ready to intervene. His motivations were a complex mix of religious conviction, political ambition, and strategic calculation. As a staunch Lutheran, Christian IV felt a strong responsibility to protect his fellow Protestants within the Holy Roman Empire, who were facing increasing persecution after the imperial victory at White Mountain. He saw himself as a champion of the Protestant cause, a role that brought him considerable prestige among the Protestant princes of northern Germany. Beyond religious solidarity, Christian IV harbored significant territorial ambitions. He was also Duke of Holstein, a German state, and sought to expand Danish influence and control over the rich trading cities and river systems of North Germany. A weakened Holy Roman Empire, or one dominated by a powerful Catholic emperor, threatened these aspirations. His involvement was further sweetened by promises of financial subsidies from England and the Dutch Republic, both Protestant nations eager to see the Habsburgs checked, but unwilling to commit their own troops directly to land warfare in Germany. These payments provided Christian IV with the necessary funds to raise and equip a substantial army, making his intervention a viable, if risky, proposition. As Christian IV prepared his forces, a new and formidable figure was rising within the imperial ranks: Albrecht von Wallenstein. Wallenstein was a Bohemian nobleman who had converted to Catholicism and amassed a vast fortune. He was a military genius, but also a ruthless opportunist. Unlike traditional commanders who relied on state funding or noble levies, Wallenstein offered Ferdinand II a revolutionary solution. He would raise, equip, and maintain an army entirely at his own expense, provided he was allowed to provision his troops by levying contributions and, if necessary, seizing resources from the territories they occupied. This system, while incredibly effective, was also brutal, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Wallenstein's army quickly grew into a massive force, loyal only to him, and largely independent of the emperor's direct control. His power and influence expanded rapidly, creating a formidable military machine that would prove instrumental in the imperial cause. Christian IV, leading his Danish and allied German forces, initially achieved some minor successes as he pushed into northern Germany. However, he soon encountered the combined might of Wallenstein's imperial army and the Catholic League forces under Count Tilly. The clash was inevitable, and the consequences were dire for the Danes. In 1626, the Battle of Lutter proved to be a catastrophic defeat for Christian IV. His army was decisively routed by Tilly's seasoned veterans, marking a turning point in the Danish intervention. This battle shattered Christian IV's image as an invincible Protestant champion and severely weakened his ability to wage war effectively. Following the victory at Lutter, Wallenstein, with his seemingly inexhaustible army, pursued the retreating Danish forces relentlessly. His troops swept through much of northern Germany, occupying vast territories that had previously been strongholds of Protestantism. Wallenstein's campaign was characterized by its efficiency and its brutality. Towns and villages were forced to pay heavy contributions to support his army, and those that resisted faced plunder and destruction. His forces advanced as far as the Baltic coast, even attempting to build a fleet, which further alarmed the northern European powers. The Danish king found himself pushed back into his own territories, his ambitions in Germany crumbling under the relentless pressure of the Imperial and Catholic League armies. The Danish intervention, which had promised to turn the tide for the Protestants, had instead resulted in a dramatic expansion of Habsburg power and the ascendancy of Wallenstein, whose shadow now loomed large over the entire Holy Roman Empire. The war was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the emperor, creating a situation that would soon provoke even greater reactions from other European states. Wallenstein's army, now a truly dominant force, effectively controlled nearly all of the Holy Roman Empire. His unique system of self-financing through contributions allowed him to maintain a massive, well-equipped fighting machine that seemed unstoppable. This sprawling military presence gave him unprecedented power and autonomy, making him a figure almost as powerful as the emperor himself. Wallenstein didn't just stop at land dominance. He began to entertain ambitions of establishing a Baltic fleet. This move, intended to further solidify imperial control over trade routes and challenge the naval power of states like Sweden, sent shivers down the spines of many European rulers. Even within the Catholic camp, princes who had initially welcomed Wallenstein's victories now grew increasingly uneasy. They worried about his immense personal wealth, his perceived arrogance, and his army's independence, which seemed to operate outside the traditional feudal structures. His ambition, they feared, knew no bounds, potentially threatening their own long-held autonomies within the empire. Emboldened by the dramatic shift in imperial fortunes and Wallenstein's successes, Emperor Ferdinand II decided to press his advantage further. In 1629, he issued the Edict of Restitution, a decree that would prove to be one of the most controversial and destabilizing acts of the entire war. The edict demanded the immediate return of all church lands that had been secularized by Protestant rulers since the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. This was a monumental demand, threatening to strip countless Protestant princes and free cities of vast territories, wealth and influence they had held for decades. The implications were far-reaching and terrifying for the Protestants. It meant the wholesale rollback of the Reformation in many areas, forced conversions, and the imposition of Catholic authority where it had long been absent. The Edict of Restitution was a massive overreach by Ferdinand II. Instead of consolidating his gains, it served to unite a broad coalition against him. Protestant princes, whose lands and power were directly threatened, saw it as an existential threat. Even some Catholic princes, who had initially supported the emperor, viewed the edict with alarm. They worried about the precedent it set for imperial interference in their internal affairs and the immense power it concentrated in Ferdinand's hands. The edict turned religious grievances into a direct territorial and political conflict, reigniting the flames of war just as the Danish intervention was winding down. It made any prospect of a lasting peace seem impossible, essentially declaring that the religious divisions of the empire could only be resolved by force and only on Catholic terms. Just as the Edict of Restitution was stirring up new opposition, the Danish phase of the war concluded. In 1629, Christian IV, his forces depleted and his ambitions dashed, signed the Peace of Lübeck. This treaty allowed Christian IV to retain his Danish territories, but it forced him to withdraw completely from the war and renounce all claims to influence in northern Germany. While it ended Danish involvement, it did little to quell the wider conflict. The emperor, now at the zenith of his power, faced growing pressure from his own allies. The Catholic princes, led by Maximilian of Bavaria, were particularly vocal in their concerns about Wallenstein. They saw his independent army and his insatiable appetite for power as a greater threat to the internal stability of the empire than any external enemy. They were also deeply resentful of the contributions Wallenstein's army was levying, even on Catholic territories, viewing it as an unacceptable burden and an affront to their sovereignty. At the Regensburg Electoral Congress in 1630, these princes presented Ferdinand II with an ultimatum. Either he dismiss Wallenstein, or they would refuse to elect his son, Ferdinand III, as his successor to the imperial throne. Faced with this direct challenge to his dynastic succession and the unity of his Catholic allies, Ferdinand II reluctantly agreed. He dismissed Wallenstein from command, a decision that would later be seen as a colossal strategic error. Wallenstein, the architect of so many imperial victories, retired to his estates, seemingly defeated but deeply resentful. The emperor had appeased his allies, but he had removed his most effective general at a time when the Edict of Restitution had just provoked a far more dangerous and powerful adversary to enter the fray. The stage was now set for the intervention of Sweden, a new and formidable force that would dramatically escalate the scale and brutality of the war. Ferdinand II's moment of imperial hegemony, born from military success, was short-lived, undermined by his own overreach and the internal politics of his allies. The war, far from ending, was about to enter its most devastating phase. The dismissal of Wallenstein, meant to appease the Catholic princes, inadvertently opened a door for a new, powerful player to enter the bloody European stage: Sweden. King Gustavus Adolphus, often called the Lion of the North, had been watching the events in Germany with keen interest. His motives were a complex mix of religious conviction, strategic ambition, and economic necessity. As a staunch Lutheran, he genuinely believed in defending his Protestant brethren in Germany against what he saw as Habsburg Catholic oppression. But beyond faith, Gustavus Adolphus harbored grand designs for Swedish dominance in the Baltic Sea, what he called Dominium Maris Baltici. He aimed to control the lucrative Baltic trade routes and establish Sweden as the leading power in northern Europe. The prospect of an increasingly powerful Habsburg Empire on his southern border, with Wallenstein even attempting to build a Baltic fleet, was a direct threat to these ambitions. France, under the shrewd guidance of Cardinal Richelieu, also recognized the potential of a Swedish intervention. Richelieu, a Catholic cardinal, was less concerned with religious solidarity and more with weakening the Habsburgs, France's traditional rivals. He saw the Habsburgs' growing power in Germany as a direct threat to French security and influence. Consequently, France began secretly funneling financial subsidies to Sweden, effectively paying Gustavus Adolphus to fight France's enemies. This arrangement, formalized later in the Treaty of Berwalde, allowed Gustavus Adolphus to finance his military operations without placing an undue burden on his own kingdom, further cementing his resolve to intervene. What made Gustavus Adolphus particularly dangerous was his genius for military innovation. He was not just a king, but a brilliant tactician and reformer. He had spent years transforming the Swedish army into one of the most effective fighting forces of its time. His reforms were revolutionary for the era, moving away from the cumbersome, slow-moving armies prevalent in Europe. He introduced lighter, more mobile artillery pieces that could be rapidly repositioned on the battlefield. He emphasized combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, cavalry, and artillery into highly coordinated units. His infantry, equipped with standardized muskets and pikes, were trained to fight in shallower, more flexible formations than the traditional Spanish tercio, allowing for greater maneuverability and firepower. Discipline and morale were paramount. His soldiers were well-trained, regularly paid, and instilled with a strong sense of national and religious purpose. Gustavus Adolphus also fostered a direct, personal bond with his troops, leading from the front and inspiring fierce loyalty. This combination of innovative tactics, superior training, and charismatic leadership made the Swedish army a formidable force, unlike any the Imperial and Catholic League forces had yet encountered. In July 1630, Gustavus Adolphus landed his army of around 13 Zosuran men on the island of Usedom in Pomerania, a strategic move that gave him a strong foothold in northern Germany. His initial progress was cautious but steady. He secured Pomerania, slowly pushing back the scattered imperial garrisons. His arrival was met with a mix of hope and apprehension by the German Protestant princes. While many welcomed a potential liberator, they were wary of committing fully, remembering the disastrous outcome of the Danish intervention. However, the sheer effectiveness of the Swedish army quickly became apparent. The turning point came in September 1631 at the Battle of Breitenfeld near Leipzig. Gustavus Adolphus's forces, augmented by Saxon allies, faced the seasoned Imperial and Catholic League army commanded by Count Tilly, the victor of White Mountain, and Lutter. Tilly's troops were renowned for their discipline and experience, but they were about to meet their match. The battle itself was a masterclass in Swedish military tactics. While the Saxon wing initially broke under Tilly's assault, Gustavus Adolphus skillfully redeployed his forces, using his mobile artillery to devastating effect and his cavalry to outflank the imperial lines. The Swedish infantry, maintaining their disciplined firing lines, inflicted heavy casualties. Tilly, for the first time in his long career, suffered a crushing defeat. His army was routed, and he himself barely escaped with his life. Breitenfeld was more than just a military victory. It was a psychological earthquake. For years, the Imperial and Catholic League armies had seemed invincible. sweeping aside Protestant resistance with brutal efficiency. Breitenfeld shattered that myth. It proved that the emperor's forces could be defeated, and decisively so. The victory instantly established Gustavus Adolphus as a military genius and a legitimate contender for control of Germany. It galvanized Protestant support, encouraging many wavering German princes to openly join the Swedish cause. The political and military landscape of the 30 Years' War was fundamentally altered. The Swedish lion had roared, and its echo reverberated across the entire continent, signaling a new and even more destructive phase of the conflict. The war was no longer just about regional disputes or a Danish king's ambitions. It was now a grand struggle for the future of the Holy Roman Empire, with a new, highly capable foreign power at the helm of the Protestant cause. The victory at Breitenfeld opened up the heart of Germany to Gustavus Adolphus and his Swedish army. This wasn't just a win, it was a green light for a rapid and deep advance into the Holy Roman Empire, a march that would shake the very foundations of Habsburg power. The Swedish king, now hailed as the Lion of the North, didn't waste any time. His forces, bolstered by new German allies and the immense prestige of their recent triumph, swept south and west, liberating Protestant territories from imperial control. Cities that had long suffered under the Catholic League's occupation now welcomed the Swedes as saviors. Mainz, Würzburg, Frankfurt, Augsburg, these and many other key centers fell to Gustavus Adolphus with surprising speed. This rapid advance was a testament to the Swedish army's superior organization and mobility. They moved faster than their imperial counterparts, often catching garrisons by surprise. The discipline that had proven so effective at Breitenfeld continued to serve them well, preventing the widespread looting and terror that often characterized other armies of the period, at least initially. This helped to secure the cooperation of local populations, who often provided supplies and intelligence. The demoralization of the imperial forces was palpable. Tilly's once invincible army had been shattered, and the remaining Imperial and Catholic League units were scattered, trying desperately to regroup and defend a vast and exposed front. The balance of power had dramatically shifted, and for the first time in years, it was the Emperor's side that was on the defensive, forced to react to the Swedish king's relentless offensive. Gustavus Adolphus was dictating the terms of the war. Count Tilly, the veteran commander who had known so much success, now faced the daunting task of stopping this Swedish tide. After the disaster at Breitenfeld, he tried to rally his remaining forces and those of the Catholic League. He was old, tired and wounded, but his determination remained. He positioned his army along the Lech River in Bavaria, hoping to block Gustavus Adolphus's advance into the Catholic heartland of the empire. The Battle of Rain, fought in April 1632, became Tilly's last stand. Gustavus Adolphus, ever the innovator, used his artillery to create a bridgehead across the river under heavy fire, a bold and risky maneuver. As the Swedes crossed, a fierce engagement ensued. During the battle, a cannonball struck Tilly, shattering his leg. The wound was severe, and he was quickly removed from the battlefield. Days later, on April 30th, 1632, the legendary commander, who had served the Habsburgs and the Catholic League for so long, succumbed to his injuries. Tilly's death was a profound blow to the imperial cause. He was arguably the most experienced and respected commander on the Catholic side, a symbol of their earlier dominance. His loss left a massive void in leadership and further deepened the sense of crisis within the Emperor Ferdinand II's court. With Tilly gone, there was no one left who could effectively command the imperial armies against the seemingly unstoppable Swedes. Ferdinand II found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. His armies were in disarray, his treasury was depleted, and his very control over the empire was slipping away. He needed a miracle, or at least a commander capable of matching Gustavus Adolphus. His thoughts inevitably turned to Albrecht von Wallenstein. Wallenstein, the brilliant but arrogant mercenary general, had been dismissed from service just a few years earlier, largely due to the complaints of German princes who resented his independent power and the devastation his army inflicted. But now, those very princes, and the emperor himself, were in no position to be picky. Ferdinand II swallowed his pride and made the desperate decision to recall Wallenstein. It was a clear sign of the emperor's dire straits that he would turn to the man he had once seen as a greater threat than an asset. Wallenstein, however, was not one to return without demanding his pound of flesh. He knew his worth, and he knew the emperor had no other choice. He imposed incredibly harsh terms for his return to command. He demanded absolute control over his army, free from interference from the emperor or any other general. He insisted on the right to appoint and dismiss his own officers, to negotiate treaties, and to confiscate lands to pay his troops. He effectively demanded to be the supreme military authority in the empire, accountable only to himself. Ferdinand II, facing the collapse of his power, reluctantly agreed to these extraordinary demands. He signed away vast portions of his imperial authority, granting Wallenstein powers that made him almost an independent ruler. The stage was now set for a titanic clash between the two greatest commanders of the war, Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedish king and Protestant champion, and Albrecht von Wallenstein, the enigmatic and ruthless imperial general, now wielding unprecedented authority. The conflict, already devastating, was about to reach a new and more brutal intensity, as these two military titans prepared to face each other on the battlefields of Germany. Wallenstein, now back in command with almost limitless power, quickly set about rebuilding and reorganizing the imperial armies. He was a master of logistics and motivation, and his reputation alone drew soldiers to his banner. He moved swiftly to confront the Swedish advance, maneuvering his forces to cut off Gustavus Adolphus's supply lines and challenge his positions. The two great generals danced around each other for months, each trying to gain an advantage without risking a decisive engagement prematurely. Wallenstein was known for his cautious approach, preferring to wear down his enemies, while Gustavus Adolphus, though brilliant, often favored aggressive direct confrontation. The inevitable clash came on November 16, 1632, near the town of Lützen. It was a cold, foggy morning, the kind of weather that could turn any battle into a chaotic nightmare. Gustavus Adolphus, eager to engage, ordered his troops forward, but the thick fog made coordination incredibly difficult. Visibility was so poor that units often lost sight of each other and even their commanders. The battle began with fierce artillery exchanges, the booming cannons echoing through the mist. As the lines finally met, the fighting quickly became a brutal, close-quarters affair. Cavalry charges smashed into infantry formations, and musketeers fired volley after volley into the swirling fog. In the midst of this chaos, Gustavus Adolphus, who always led from the front, rode ahead of his main cavalry regiment. He was reportedly trying to get a better view of the enemy lines or to rally some wavering troops. Accounts differ, but what is certain is that he became separated from his main bodyguard in the dense fog. A group of imperial horsemen stumbled upon him. In the ensuing skirmish, the Swedish king was shot multiple times. One bullet struck him in the arm, another in the back, and a third, possibly from close range, hit him in the head. He fell from his horse, his body stripped by opportunistic imperial soldiers who didn't recognize him, but simply saw a richly dressed officer. His horse, a cream-colored charger, galloped back to the Swedish lines, riderless and bloody, signaling the terrible news. The death of Gustavus Adolphus sent shockwaves through the Swedish army. Initially, many refused to believe it, but once confirmed, it ignited a furious desire for revenge. The Swedish forces, now led by commanders like Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar, fought with renewed ferocity, determined to avenge their fallen king. Despite the devastating loss of their charismatic leader, the Swedes managed to push back Wallenstein's forces. The battle continued for hours, a bloody, confusing struggle in the fog. By the end of the day, Wallenstein decided to withdraw, having suffered heavy casualties and failing to break the Swedish resolve. Technically, Lützen was a tactical victory for the Swedes, as they held the field and Wallenstein retreated. But the cost was immense. The death of Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, was a catastrophic blow to the Protestant cause. He was not just a military leader, he was a symbol, a rallying point, and a strategic genius. His loss left a massive leadership vacuum and severely impacted the morale of the Protestant alliance. The Swedish war effort, now under the control of Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, would continue, but it would never again possess the same dynamic, offensive power that Gustavus Adolphus had provided. The war, which had seemed to be turning decisively in favor of the Protestants, now entered a new, grim phase without its most inspiring figure. Meanwhile, Wallenstein, despite his retreat from Lützen, was still a formidable power. But his actions and increasing independence were causing deep concern in Vienna. After Lützen, he became even more enigmatic, engaging in secret negotiations with various parties, including the Swedes and the French. His motives were unclear. Was he trying to broker a peace that would benefit him personally? Was he trying to carve out his own kingdom? Or was he simply trying to consolidate his power and influence within the empire? Emperor Ferdinand II, who had reluctantly granted Wallenstein almost unlimited authority, now grew increasingly suspicious of his general's intentions. Wallenstein's refusal to follow orders, his apparent disloyalty, and his growing network of personal alliances made him a dangerous figure. The imperial court was rife with rumors of his treason. Ferdinand II, having previously dismissed Wallenstein only to recall him in desperation, now made a final, ruthless decision. He issued secret orders to have Wallenstein removed from command and, if necessary, killed. On February 25, 1634, Wallenstein was assassinated by a group of his own officers, led by an Irishman named Walter Butler in the town of Eger. They burst into his quarters and murdered him, along with several of his loyal lieutenants. The official story put out by the emperor was that Wallenstein had been planning to betray him and had therefore been justly executed. The assassination of Wallenstein removed one of the most complex and controversial figures of the war. He was a brilliant strategist, a ruthless mercenary, and a man whose ambition ultimately led to his downfall. His death marked the end of an era of independent, all-powerful mercenary armies and consolidated more direct control under the emperor. But it also robbed the imperial side of its most capable commander at a critical juncture. With both Gustavus Adolphus and Wallenstein gone, the war entered a new, more protracted, and even more devastating phase, one that would increasingly draw in other European powers. The war, already a brutal grind, took another sharp turn after the deaths of its two most prominent commanders. The imperial forces, now without Wallenstein, still managed to achieve a significant victory at the Battle of Nördlingen in 1634. This battle was a major setback for the Swedish and German Protestant alliance. A combined imperial and Spanish army, led by Ferdinand III and the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand of Spain, thoroughly routed the Protestant forces. The Swedes, under their commander Gustav Horn, suffered heavy losses. This defeat severely weakened Sweden's position in southern Germany and forced them to retreat, losing much of the territory they had gained under Gustavus Adolphus. The Battle of Nördlingen had a profound impact. It showed that even without Wallenstein, the Habsburg forces could still be formidable, especially when reinforced by Spanish troops. It also convinced many German Protestant princes that continuing the war alongside the Swedes was no longer a viable option. The emperor, seeing an opportunity to isolate Sweden and consolidate his power, offered a new peace deal. This led to the Peace of Prague in 1635, signed between Emperor Ferdinand II and most of the Protestant states within the Holy Roman Empire, notably Saxony and Brandenburg. Under this treaty, the Edict of Restitution was largely revoked, and many of the church lands seized by Protestants were allowed to remain in their possession, though some had to be returned. The treaty also aimed to create a unified imperial army, effectively dissolving the various regional forces that had been fighting. While the Peace of Prague brought a temporary end to hostilities between the emperor and many German states, it failed to bring true peace to the empire. For one, France was not included in the negotiations, and its interests were directly opposed to a stronger, more unified Habsburg Empire. Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister to King Louis XV of France, had been subtly funding Protestant powers for years, seeking to weaken the Habsburgs who surrounded France. He saw the Peace of Prague not as an end to the war, but as a dangerous consolidation of Habsburg power. Richelieu had long pursued a strategy of weakening the Habsburgs, both in Spain and in the Holy Roman Empire. He viewed a dominant Habsburg power as a direct threat to French security and influence in Europe. With the Swedish forces weakened and many German princes making peace with the emperor, Richelieu realized that France could no longer rely on proxies. It was time for direct intervention. In 1635, France formally declared war on Habsburg Spain and, shortly after, on the Holy Roman Empire. This declaration marked a critical turning point in the 30 Years' War. It transformed the conflict from primarily a German religious and dynastic struggle into a broader European power struggle, with France openly challenging the Habsburgs for continental dominance. France's entry into the war brought massive resources and new strategic objectives to the conflict. Richelieu's aim was clear: to break the Habsburg encirclement of France, expand French territory, and establish France as the leading power in Europe. This meant fighting on multiple fronts. French armies were deployed to the Spanish Netherlands, along the Rhine frontier, in Italy, and even providing direct support to the remaining Swedish forces in Germany. With France's direct involvement, the nature of the war changed dramatically. It became less about religious differences within the Holy Roman Empire and more about dynastic rivalry and geopolitical power. The scale of the war increased significantly, drawing in more resources and manpower. New commanders emerged on the French side, who would go on to become legendary figures in military history. Louis II de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, known simply as Condé, and Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, Viscount of Turenne, quickly rose through the ranks. These were brilliant military minds who would lead French armies to significant victories in the coming years. Condé, a young and daring general, would achieve fame for his aggressive tactics and decisive victories. Turenne, equally skilled, was known for his strategic brilliance and disciplined campaigns. Their leadership, combined with France's growing military might, would challenge the long-standing dominance of the Spanish tercios and imperial armies. The war now became a multi-front conflict of attrition. The French, Swedish, and remaining Protestant German forces faced off against the imperial Spanish and Bavarian armies. The devastation across the Holy Roman Empire deepened as armies marched back and forth, foraging for supplies and engaging in brutal sieges. The lines between combatants and civilians blurred even further as the constant demand for resources led to widespread plundering and destruction. The entry of France, while providing a new lease on life for the anti-Habsburg alliance, also ensured that the war would drag on for many more years, inflicting even greater suffering on the populations caught in the middle. The strategic landscape of Europe had fundamentally shifted, setting the stage for a prolonged and costly phase of the conflict. The war had now fully transformed into a grinding multinational conflict. The intervention of France, while tipping the scales against the Habsburgs, also extended the agony for everyone involved. For years, the fighting settled into a devastating pattern of attrition. This wasn't a war of swift, decisive campaigns anymore, but a brutal, drawn-out struggle, where victory often meant simply outlasting the enemy. The nature of warfare itself became incredibly harsh. Armies, often numbering tens of thousands, moved across the landscape, their presence a guarantee of misery for the local population. Sieges became commonplace, with towns and cities surrounded for months, their inhabitants slowly starving or succumbing to disease. These sieges weren't just about military strategy, they were about breaking the will of the people inside. Scorched earth tactics, where armies deliberately destroyed crops, villages, and infrastructure to deny resources to the enemy, became standard practice. This left vast swathes of land desolate, unable to support life. Irregular warfare also became more prevalent. With official armies often too large and slow to deal with every threat, smaller, often brutal, bands of soldiers or mercenaries would roam the countryside. They were sometimes allied with one side or another, but often acted for their own gain, preying on civilians. This breakdown of order meant that even if you weren't directly in the path of a major army, you were still at risk. The suffering of the civilian population reached unimaginable levels. Famine was constant. With fields unplanted, harvests destroyed, and supply lines disrupted, food became incredibly scarce. People ate bark, roots, and even resorted to cannibalism in the most desperate areas. Disease spread rampant, often more deadly than the battles themselves. Typhus, dysentery, and the plague followed the armies, decimating populations already weakened by hunger and stress. Entire villages were wiped out not by sword, but by sickness. Displacement was another huge problem. Millions became refugees, fleeing their homes in search of safety or food, only to often find more suffering elsewhere. The fabric of society began to unravel. Law and order collapsed in many areas, leading to widespread banditry. People formed self-defense groups, but these were often just as brutal as the raiders they were meant to fight. Military campaigns during this phase of the war were characterized by numerous battles and skirmishes, but often without truly decisive outcomes. Both sides were so exhausted, their resources so depleted, that neither could land a knockout blow. The French, with their new commanders like Condé and Turenne, achieved local victories, but these rarely translated into a strategic breakthrough that could end the war. The Swedes, still a formidable force despite Gustavus Adolphus's death, continued to fight fiercely in northern Germany, but their manpower was stretched thin. The Imperial and Spanish armies, while suffering immense losses, still held significant territory and could draw on vast reserves, even if those reserves were becoming harder to mobilize. The entry of Spain into the conflict, formally declaring war on France in support of their Habsburg cousins, further complicated the geopolitical landscape. Spain was already fighting a long war with the Dutch Republic, the 80 Years' War, and now found itself battling France on multiple fronts. This stretched Spanish resources to their absolute limit, but it also meant that France had to divert significant forces to its southern and eastern borders, preventing them from concentrating all their power in the Holy Roman Empire. The war became a complex web of interconnected conflicts, each feeding into the other, making a comprehensive peace incredibly difficult to achieve. The exhaustion of resources and manpower on all sides was palpable. Armies struggled with recruitment, supply, and morale. Soldiers, many of whom had been fighting for years, were weary and often mutinous. The financial cost of the war was crippling, with governments resorting to desperate measures to fund their armies, leading to inflation and economic collapse in many regions. The economic and demographic impact on the Holy Roman Empire was catastrophic and long-lasting. Population decline was immense. In some regions, particularly those that saw heavy fighting or repeated occupations, estimates suggest that up to 50 to 70% of the population perished. This wasn't just battle deaths, it was famine, disease, and the breakdown of society. The total population of Germany may have fallen from around 16 to 17 million before the war to as low as 10 to 12 million by its end. This demographic shock would take generations to recover from. The destruction of infrastructure was widespread. Towns and cities were razed, castles demolished, bridges broken, and roads left to decay. Agricultural land lay fallow, often for years, as farmers were killed, displaced, or simply had no means to work their fields. Trade routes were disrupted, markets collapsed, and the nascent industries that had begun to develop before the war were shattered. The long-term economic and social consequences for the Holy Roman Empire were dire. It would remain fragmented and economically backward for centuries compared to its more unified and prosperous neighbors. The war had not only reshaped the political map of Europe, but had also left an indelible scar on the heart of the continent, a testament to the brutal cost of unchecked religious and political ambition. This period of attrition, though less dramatic in individual battles than earlier phases, was arguably the most devastating in its cumulative effect. The relentless grind of the 30 Years' War, marked by widespread devastation and a cruel stalemate, eventually began to show signs of shifting. Even as the continent bled, certain decisive moments on the battlefield and the sheer exhaustion of all parties started to push Europe, however slowly, towards the negotiating table. The French, despite the immense strain on their resources, began to assert their military superiority with increasing clarity in the 1640s. One of the most significant of these victories was the Battle of Rocroi in 1643. This battle, fought in what is now northern France, pitted a young French army led by the brilliant Prince of Condé against the formidable Spanish tercios. For generations, the Spanish tercios had been considered the elite fighting force of Europe, virtually invincible in open battle. They were disciplined, well-trained, and had a fearsome reputation. However, Rocroi proved to be their undoing. The French infantry, supported by cavalry and artillery, executed a complex maneuver that encircled and ultimately shattered the Spanish formations. The victory was not just a tactical success. It was a symbolic turning point. It signaled the decline of Spanish military dominance, which had lasted for over a century, and marked the ascendancy of France as the premier military power in Europe. This was a massive blow to the Habsburg cause, both in Spain and within the Holy Roman Empire, as their most reliable and feared troops were shown to be vulnerable. Years later, in 1648, another critical French victory further cemented their position. The Battle of Lens, fought in the Spanish Netherlands, saw Condé once again lead French forces to a decisive triumph over a combined Spanish and Imperial army. This battle inflicted heavy casualties on the Habsburg forces and effectively broke their offensive capabilities in the Low Countries. These victories, Rocroi and Lens, were instrumental in weakening the Spanish and Imperial resolve, showing them that continued fighting would only lead to further losses and humiliation. They demonstrated that the tide had truly turned against the Habsburgs, and that France, despite the enormous cost, was winning the military struggle. Meanwhile, within the Holy Roman Empire, the situation for the emperor was growing increasingly dire. Ferdinand II, the staunch Catholic who had initiated the Edict of Restitution and overseen much of the war's early phases, died in 1637. His son, Ferdinand III, ascended to the imperial throne. While Ferdinand III was also a devout Catholic, he inherited a realm ravaged by war and a treasury emptied by endless campaigns. He was more pragmatic than his father, but also faced an empire that was increasingly fragmented and exhausted. The emperor's ability to effectively counter the combined French and Swedish pressure was greatly diminished. His own German princes, even many Catholic ones, were weary of the war and increasingly unwilling to contribute further men or money to a cause that seemed to be continually losing ground. The imperial army, once a formidable force under Wallenstein, was now a shadow of its former self, reliant on mercenaries and often poorly supplied. The growing desire for peace became palpable across Europe. The war had dragged on for 3 decades, causing untold suffering and economic ruin. Even those who had initially championed the conflict for religious or political reasons were now desperate for an end to the bloodshed. The population, decimated by famine and disease, yearned for stability. Rulers, faced with dwindling resources and mounting internal unrest, began to grudgingly accept that a military victory for any one side was unlikely, and that a negotiated settlement was the only viable path forward. This widespread exhaustion and the shifting military balance finally paved the way for serious peace initiatives. In 1643, formal peace congresses were opened, not in one location, but in 2 separate cities, Münster and Osnabrück, both in Westphalia. This unusual arrangement was a reflection of the deep divisions that still existed, particularly between Catholic and Protestant powers, and the sheer number of parties involved. The Catholic powers, including the Holy Roman Emperor Spain and France, largely gathered in Münster, while the Protestant powers, primarily Sweden and the various German Protestant states, met in Osnabrück. The opening of these congresses marked the beginning of an incredibly slow and complex process of diplomatic negotiations. It was not a straightforward affair, as each power had its own set of demands, grievances, and territorial ambitions. The initial stages were fraught with disagreements over protocol, precedents, and the very structure of the negotiations. Simply getting all the delegates to agree on where to sit, who spoke first, and how decisions would be made was a monumental task. The sheer number of delegates, representing hundreds of different entities from major kingdoms to small imperial cities, made progress agonizingly slow. This was not a quick handshake deal, but a painstaking, multi-year endeavor to untangle 3 decades of conflict and reshape the political and religious landscape of an entire continent. The opening of these congresses marked the beginning of an incredibly slow and complex process of diplomatic negotiations. It was not a straightforward affair, as each power had its own set of demands, grievances, and territorial ambitions. The initial stages were fraught with disagreements over protocol, precedents, and the very structure of the negotiations. Simply getting all the delegates to agree on where to sit, who spoke first, and how decisions would be made was a monumental task. The sheer number of delegates, representing hundreds of different entities from major kingdoms to small imperial cities, made progress agonizingly slow. This was not a quick handshake deal, but a painstaking multi-year endeavor to untangle 3 decades of conflict and reshape the political and religious landscape of an entire continent. The Congress of Westphalia, as these combined negotiations came to be known, was a diplomatic spectacle unlike any seen before. It involved hundreds of representatives from nearly every major and minor power in Europe. Diplomats, princes, and their entourages converged on Münster and Osnabrück, turning these relatively small cities into bustling centers of international intrigue. In Münster, the Catholic powers, led by the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and France, held court. Meanwhile, in Osnabrück, the Protestant powers, Primarily, Sweden and the various Protestant states within the empire gathered. This physical separation underscored the deep religious and political chasm that still divided Europe, even as they sought peace. The sheer number of delegates was astounding. There were envoys from the Emperor, the King of France, the Queen of Sweden, the King of Spain, the Dutch Republic, and Venice. But beyond these major players, there were also representatives from countless German princely states, imperial cities, bishoprics, and even smaller lordships. Each of these entities had its own specific interests, territorial claims, and historical grievances that needed to be addressed. The complexity of managing these diverse interests, often conflicting, was immense. Key diplomats emerged as central figures, working tirelessly to bridge the divides. Men like Count Trautmannsdorf for the Emperor, Henri II d'Orléans, Duke of Longueville for France, and Johann Oxenstierna, son of the late Swedish Chancellor for Sweden, spent years navigating this diplomatic labyrinth. Their efforts involved endless meetings, formal negotiations, backroom deals, and constant communication with their respective sovereigns. One of the most contentious issues was religious freedom. The Peace of Augsburg, established nearly a century earlier, had recognized Lutheranism but had explicitly excluded Calvinism. Now, with Calvinist powers like the Dutch Republic and many German princes playing significant roles, there was a strong demand for Calvinism to be officially recognized as a legitimate confession within the empire. This meant extending the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion, to include Calvinist rulers, allowing them to determine the religion of their territories. However, the emperor and other staunch Catholic powers fiercely resisted this, viewing it as a further erosion of Catholic authority and a betrayal of their faith. Beyond religion, territorial adjustments formed another massive hurdle. Every warring party had demands for land, often at the expense of their neighbors or the emperor. France, having borne a significant burden of the war, sought to expand its eastern borders, particularly in Alsace, and to weaken the Habsburg grip on the Holy Roman Empire. They pushed for guarantees of German particularism, meaning the continued independence and autonomy of the numerous German states, which would prevent the emperor from centralizing power and posing a threat to France. Sweden, too, demanded significant territorial gains, especially in North Germany, including Western Pomerania and other strategically important coastal areas, to secure its control over the Baltic Sea. They also sought substantial war indemnities to compensate for their extensive military involvement. The future of the Holy Roman Empire's constitution was also on the table. The war had proven the weakness of the emperor's authority over the disparate German states. Many princes, both Protestant and Catholic, desired greater autonomy and a formal reduction of imperial power. The emperor naturally resisted any attempts to further diminish his authority, seeing it as an attack on the very fabric of the empire. He was reluctant to concede significant territory or power, especially to his long-standing rivals, France and Sweden. The Habsburgs, having fought for decades to maintain their dominance, found themselves in a difficult position, forced to negotiate from a position of weakness, yet still unwilling to surrender their perceived rights. These complex demands, coupled with the lingering distrust and animosity born from decades of brutal conflict, made every step towards peace incredibly arduous. The process was less about swift resolutions and more about grinding down resistance, inch by agonizing inch. After years of painstaking negotiations, the ceaseless diplomatic dance finally culminated in a series of treaties in 1648. These agreements, signed in the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück, collectively became known as the Peace of Westphalia. This monumental event marked the official end of the 30 Years' War, a conflict that had ravaged Central Europe for 3 decades, and also concluded the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic. a struggle for independence that had spanned generations. The signing of these treaties was not just a cessation of hostilities, it was a reordering of the European continent, establishing principles that would govern international relations for centuries to come. The Peace of Westphalia addressed the most pressing issues that had fueled the wars, beginning with religion. One of its key provisions was the formal confirmation of the Peace of Augsburg, but with a crucial amendment. It now extended official recognition to Calvinism alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism. This meant that the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion, now applied to all three major Christian confessions within the Holy Roman Empire. While this principle still allowed rulers to determine the official religion of their territories, the treaties also included important provisions for religious minorities. In many areas, subjects were granted the right to practice their faith in private or to emigrate if their ruler's religion differed from their own. This was a significant step towards religious tolerance, acknowledging the futility of trying to enforce religious uniformity across such a diverse empire. Politically, the impact of the Peace of Westphalia was profound, particularly for the Holy Roman Empire. The treaties formally recognized the sovereignty of over 300 German states, principalities, and free cities. This recognition severely weakened the power of the Holy Roman Emperor, transforming his role from a potentially strong monarch into more of a ceremonial figurehead, with limited direct control over the vast majority of the empire. Each of these German states gained the right to conduct its own foreign policy, form alliances, and declare war, provided these actions were not directed against the emperor or the empire. This fragmentation ensured that Germany would remain politically divided for a long time, preventing the rise of a powerful central authority that might challenge the emerging powers of France and Sweden. Furthermore, the Peace of Westphalia formally recognized the independence of the Swiss Confederacy and the Dutch Republic, both of which had effectively been operating as independent entities for some time, but now received official international acknowledgement of their sovereign status. Territorial adjustments were another significant outcome of the peace. France, having played a pivotal role in weakening the Habsburgs, made substantial gains. It acquired territories in Alsace, solidifying its eastern border and expanding its influence. Sweden, as a victorious power, also received considerable territories in North Germany, including western Pomerania, the city of Wismar, and the bishoprics of Bremen and Verden. These acquisitions gave Sweden vital control over the mouths of major German rivers, enhancing its economic and strategic dominance in the Baltic Sea region. Brandenburg Prussia, an emerging power, also benefited, gaining several secularized bishoprics and other territories, which laid the groundwork for its future growth and eventual rise as a major European player. These territorial shifts redrew the map of Central Europe and significantly altered the balance of power. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Peace of Westphalia was the birth of what historians and political scientists now refer to as the modern state system or the Westphalian system. This system established the principle of state sovereignty, meaning that each state had exclusive authority over its territory and internal affairs, free from external interference. It emphasized the concept of non-interference in the domestic matters of other sovereign states, a cornerstone of international law that persists to this day. The treaties also promoted the idea of a balance of power among European states, where no single power should become so dominant as to threaten the security of others. This framework marked a decisive shift away from the medieval concept of a universal Christian empire or a single overarching religious authority. Instead, it heralded the rise of independent nation-states, each pursuing its own interests within a system of diplomatic relations and international law. The decline of universal empires and the increasing importance of these sovereign territorial states fundamentally reshaped the political landscape of Europe and set the stage for the development of modern international relations. The immense human and material cost of the 30 Years' War, particularly in Germany, left an indelible mark on the continent. The scale of the devastation was almost unimaginable, with estimates suggesting that some regions of the Holy Roman Empire lost up to 50% or even 70% of their population. This was not just military casualties. The vast majority of deaths were civilians succumbing to famine, disease, and the brutal violence that accompanied the armies. Towns lay in ruins, agricultural lands were scorched, and trade routes were disrupted for decades. The long process of demographic, economic, and social recovery stretched across generations, fundamentally altering the fabric of German society. Whole villages vanished, and the memory of the war became deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness, shaping art, literature, and political thought for centuries. The cultural and psychological impact on those who lived through the conflict and their descendants was profound, fostering a deep-seated desire for peace and stability that would influence future European policies. This catastrophic conflict also triggered a significant shift in European power dynamics. The decline of Habsburg dominance, which had been a defining feature of European politics for over a century, was perhaps the most immediate and tangible outcome. While the Spanish Habsburgs continued to be a major power, their military and economic strength had been severely depleted by the war, signaling the beginning of their slow decline. The Holy Roman Emperor, now stripped of much of his effective power over the German states, could no longer realistically aspire to universal monarchy or even strong centralized control within the empire. In stark contrast, France emerged as the new dominant power in Europe. Cardinal Richelieu's strategic intervention had been a resounding success, weakening France's traditional Habsburg rivals and establishing French military and diplomatic preeminence. This rise of France under Louis XIV would define the next era of European history. Beyond these major players, the war also saw the emergence of Sweden and Brandenburg-Prussia as significant regional powers. Sweden, though it would eventually recede from its position as a great power, gained crucial territories that cemented its control over the Baltic Sea for a time. Brandenburg-Prussia, through its territorial gains and its increasingly centralized administration, laid the essential foundations for its future as the Kingdom of Prussia, eventually becoming a driving force behind German unification centuries later. The long-term consequences of the 30 Years' War were far-reaching and continue to resonate even today. One of the most significant was the fragmentation of Germany. The Peace of Westphalia enshrined the political independence of hundreds of German states, ensuring that Germany would remain a patchwork of separate entities for over 2 centuries. This delayed the formation of a unified German nation-state, profoundly impacting its historical trajectory and its role in European affairs. Crucially, the war marked the end of large-scale religious wars in Europe. While religious tensions would persist, the idea of fighting major conflicts purely over religious doctrine became increasingly untenable after the immense destruction witnessed. The recognition of Calvinism and the establishment of a more inclusive religious framework, however imperfect, helped to depoliticize religious differences to some extent. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Peace of Westphalia was the establishment of international law and diplomacy as key tools for managing interstate relations. The congresses at Münster and Osnabrück, involving numerous delegates and complex negotiations, set a precedent for future multilateral diplomacy. The principles of state sovereignty, non-interference in internal affairs, and the balance of power enshrined in the Westphalian treaties became the foundational pillars of the modern international system. This Westphalian system moved away from the notion of a universal empire or religious authority, instead recognizing a world of independent, sovereign states interacting with each other through established legal and diplomatic channels. In essence, the 30 Years' War, born from religious strife and dynastic ambition, reshaped the political, religious, and social landscape of Europe. It was a brutal and devastating conflict, particularly for the German lands, but from its ashes emerged a new European order. This new order, characterized by the rise of sovereign states and a system of international law, laid the groundwork for the world we recognize today. The Westphalian system, forged in the crucible of this terrible war, continues to be a central framework for understanding international relations, making the 30 Years' War a pivotal moment in human history, a stark reminder of the costs of conflict, and a testament to the enduring human quest for a more stable and ordered world.